Well, I am live, and things might look a little different for the lunatics. And um, I normally am wearing headgear and covering up um, the hair that was left on my head, although since I hadn't had a haircut since about mid-February or so, probably wasn't clear that I had some hair, and it added up. It was voluminous. However, it was patchy. Let's just leave it at that. And I have to point out that yesterday's show, I had counted on the Facebook live producer link to remember as I reloaded it that it was a hotlou.com broadcast. But as I look on the page, yesterday's show actually isn't on the hotlou.com stream. So it went live on my personal account. So some of you lunatics got to miss me shaving my head live on Hotlou Happy Hour. But thankfully, we'll be able to download that show and then rebroadcast it. I think over the weekend. We'll try to make that happen. But seems like right now is as good a time as any to start the show. And normally I'd play the music, but by using this new software and having already played the music, I'm just going to introduce it. So welcome to Hotlou Happy Hour. I'm your host, Louis Bromowski, or somewhat aerodynamically known as Hotlou. So today's show is going to be a little bit more brief. And I don't know, just cleaner, right? We've got normally, like I said, I wear a hat or something, and I had planned on just going with the Bic today, but hadn't gotten around to that just yet. So after the show, I'll be hitting the gym and then the showers and then taking a razor to the head. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But today I wanted to talk about a couple of things. The first one being Juneteenth. So today's June 19th. This is what I have only recently learned is a holiday that had been previously celebrated, I think, kind of in a limited fashion all across the country, but a little bit more in Texas where the original event occurred. But in case you're not familiar, Juneteenth is I have a really hard time saying Juneteenth. I don't know about you lunatics. And I'm actually going to start a poll here because I'm pretty curious to see how many of you had heard of Juneteenth prior to this year, because I may have heard of it, but it certainly didn't stick with me. But so Juneteenth is this portmanteau, and of course, in case you don't know, a portmanteau is basically merging two words together, which has its own funny story and roots in the internet. But it's a portmanteau of the two words June and 19th. Of course, today is June 19th. I guess in other circles, it's also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, or Liberation Day. And it had previously been a Texas state holiday celebrating the day to commemorate the Union Army General Gordon Granger announcing federal orders in the city of Galveston, Texas in 1865, proclaiming that all slaves in Texas were now free. Of course, I'm sure many of our historians among the lunatics are already familiar with this, but the Emancipation Proclamation from President Lincoln had already formally freed the slaves through an executive order 2.5 years earlier. And of course, the end of the American Civil War had largely ended with the defeat of the Confederate States in April, which then helped kind of enforcement of the proclamation, but it had been slow kind of throughout the Civil War. But Texas was relatively remote in 1865 and vast and large in terms of where the presence of the Union troops were. So, I guess it's a pretty common misconception that this day marks the end of slavery in the United States. And although this marks the day that the uh, emancipation of all slaves in the Confederacy um, became free, the institution of slavery was actually still, I think, technically legal. Today Mike's not on the show to be our resident historian. However, um, the actual freeing of the slaves legally and federally didn't officially end until the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which we've heard in the comments from many of the lunatics that uh, the 13th documentary is pretty fascinating. And I've watched it. I had a little bit of a harder time kind of following it. I did feel like there was some stretches in the narrative, but it was pretty informative. Um, and part of the 13th documentary does really try to drive home a narrative that as slavery became illegal, that other institutions continuously kept creeping into federal or state law or even just culture in general to basically just allow slavery to continue under a new name. And in fact, even with the 13th Amendment itself, I think many people think that that just means slavery is abolished in the United States, but the reality is that it only abolishes slavery in the context of a non penalty. So it only abolished non penal slavery. So that basically means that if you are convicted of a crime, and there's probably some nuance that I don't fully understand here, but that slavery is effectively not abolished within the criminal justice system, which is part of the argument that the 13th documentary really tries to make, in that the current criminal justice system is just a modern form of slavery. And I think many people have heard this over the years, but not really fully grasped it. But watching that documentary, and I've been watching part of the Black Lives Matter collection over the last couple of weeks on Netflix, and I recommend people go through it. And there's one show in particular that I'm going to recommend. But I've seen many people talking about the 13th documentary, and I think it is really informative. But that was probably my biggest takeaway from that, is that the criminal justice system basically allows for slavery in a modern way. I'm not going to try to make the argument all across there. Watch the documentary. I think it does a pretty good job of explaining that perspective. And just generally, Jim Crow and a handful of the other things that become all of these different modern forms of slavery that make it very difficult for Black Americans to escape this cycle of socioeconomic disadvantage, that are either by design, specifically to keep Black Americans within that cycle, or maybe even either accidentally or deliberately. So I definitely recommend people check that out. And I'm also going to recommend people check out, I just finished yesterday or the day before, the docudrama series on Netflix called When They See Us. And I have to say, that was shatteringly saddening. I really that one really impacted me quite a bit, I have to say. And had a hard time with that one. I had no idea. So When They See Us is about what I think many people are familiar with, which is the Central Park Five. So these five black teenagers in New York City, ended up becoming convicted um, of a crime of attacking and raping a jogger in Central Park in 1989. And that uh, that jogger was beaten so severely she didn't actually recall any of the events of the um, attack. So when she eventually recovered, she had what I think became permanent injuries, and couldn't really testify to exonerate the five young men, um, or boys, really. And the prosecution and the police, through just an unconscionable amount of overzealous crime fighting, ended up getting these five boys convicted. Um, well, I think many people know. 13 years later, 14 years later, um, another inmate in another prison confessed to the crime. DNA evidence at the time made the prosecution and the defense to these boys able to put some DNA testing behind it and exonerate all five of what then became, um, you know, approaching middle-aged men who had just spent 14 years in prison, some of which were awful and changed the boys' lives. And or that's not fair. It changed all of the boys' lives for the worse. Uh, there, and I'm not going to spoil everything, but there a bunch of craziness happens during the whole process, and some of the boys, in fact, the worst one, Corey, the one that ended up probably having to deal with just the absolute worst scenario in it, was Corey. I'm looking for the name here. Um, let's see, Wise. Corey Wise, by the accounts in the docudrama, really wasn't even anywhere around the park when it happened, or might have been in the park when it happened, but when they came looking for people to charge with the crime of the attack and rape, he wasn't even a suspect at the time. But in order to support his friends, he went with them to the police station, and he ended up getting the worst of all of the convictions and many, many other terrible layers to his fate. The other crazy thing that kind of happened here, and um, and I'm not going to spoil the ending if you don't fully know kind of everything, because it's probably better to kind of watch the whole thing. But they do obviously end up exonerated and are freed. But the other crazy thing that happens during this whole mess is that Donald Trump put out a full page ad in the New York Times, basically asking to bring back the death penalty. Um, and I think specifically, as I'm trying to pull it up here, uh, the absolute just unconscionable uh, uh, bigotry that kind of went into this whole thing. And we'll try to put some of the videos and things in the show notes and links to everything. Um, and I'm trying to pull up the actual full page ad that he put in the New York Times, that I think he spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $85,000 just to put it out there. Um, let's see. Yeah, so the headline on it was "Bring Back the Death Penalty, Bring Back Our Police." And he brought that out in the midst of uh, this whole charade of convicting these five boys who had nothing to do with the actual crime. It's a devastating story. I recommend everybody check it out. It's I think about 4 1-hour episodes, and it looks like my stream has ended. What happened here? Okay, let's see if I can resume the stream here. All right, I'm gonna have to stop and restart. I have no idea when it stopped or why. Let's try this. Unable to connect. Okay.